Hello and welcome to this special episode of Superhero Ethics. It is currently 3:06 a.m. Central Time, 1:06 Pacific Time. Paul and I have quite literally just finished watching episode 3 of Moon Knight, and we are here to talk about it. All that and more after a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. I hope you're enjoying that new theme music. That is by Villain's Lament, Paul's old band. There'll be more of that song at the end of this. Episode, as well as a link to more information about it in the show notes. Paul, how are we doing tonight?
Doing great. Yeah, I've had a pretty fun day and capped it off watching episode 3 of Moon Knight, which I'm still enjoying the series with very few reservations.
Yeah, I definitely feel that way. I have my own version of a bit of the vegan thing that you had last time that I'm going to want to bring up that we're going to get into, but there's so much good stuff. But I want to start with, I'm always asking folks for feedback. We're getting some good feedback from folks who are like, look, here's just stuff I want to share with you that we're kind of incorporating in, but here's someone who was totally fine with us reading it on air. This email comes from Jordan from California. And she lets us know her pronouns. Appreciate that. Jordan asks, what do y'all think of the ethics behind one personality making the decision to join up with Khonshu without the consent of the other personalities? Hard to think that Steven, based on what I've seen through episode 2, would agree to join Khonshu if it meant being violent and moving well beyond his scope of abilities. Again, as far as we've seen. Does your answer change depending on when the Steven personality was manifested? Thank you for your consideration. Love what you do here and Star Wars Universe Podcasts. Have a great day. That's the first time I've heard someone. I mean, it's a common saying, but that's become kind of my tag phrase. So I love that. Thank you, Jordan, for echoing that back. And yeah, that was a great question after episode 2. But Jordan, clearly you were a prognosticator because I feel like, especially after episode 3, we got a lot more depth to that question. So, Paul, take it away. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how much the personalities know about one another. It seems that Mark has been aware of Steven for some time, but that Steven hasn't necessarily been explicitly aware of Mark, but has been aware of something, right? And, I guess a lot of it depends on the context. Broadly speaking, I think making major life decisions without consulting all of yourself sort of seems not great. It's hard in terms of knowing whether this is actually dissociative identity disorder or whether it's something else that's specific to what's going on with Khonshu as the avatar. I think it isn't connected to that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think this episode kind of pushed me towards that. What I've been wondering this whole time is this a situation where Khonshu, this person named Steven had just been around for a while, and then Khonshu had created this Mark personality to be the avatar. So it was a, kind of supernatural thing that's mimicking a thing that we know as DID, but actually isn't.
Right.
Last episode started to make me think that wasn't the case because Steven clearly had this whole existing life. I'm sorry, Mark still had this whole existing life. And I think after this episode, again, it's not 100% clear, but it feels more and more to me and I don't think I'm using the proper terminology here. And I think I'm now going to commit to really trying to learn a lot more about DID. Now I think we definitely are leaning in that direction. But using the terminology as best I understand it, I think Mark is kind of the dominant personality and that Steven had been occasionally manifesting, but that something has happened in the last couple of months that has caused Steven to become a much bigger part of what's happening with this person. So is that kind of your impression as well?
I'm very unsure of that. I think, when Mark said I had it under control until recently, I'm not sure if that means kind of he had Steven locked up basically, or if that means that Steven was Steven most of the time, right? But then Mark was kind of controlling when he was Mark in some way. Also, I think in this episode, it became clear that there is at least a third personality.
Right. I guess for me, the thing that, and Jordan, I promise we'll get to your question, but this is kind of setting the context of it. I think the thing that makes me lead in this direction is one thing that I do know about DID is that often it can be very difficult to like maintain different kinds of maintain a life, because how do you keep going to a job as one personality if then the other personality is going to manifest from time to time? And the idea that you could have Stephen living a full life, getting a job, having people know him as Stephen, going to the museum often enough to have a job, while you also have Mark manifesting enough that Layla can be married to him, and that they're sort of living parallel lives at the same time, that I find that very hard to believe, and the way they set it up, it seemed that the impression I at least got was that, a lot of these people had only really met Stephen in the last couple months. They talked about how he hadn't really had a job long before then, and that Layla hadn't heard from him from a couple of months. So that's why it kind of felt to me like this was mostly Mark, and Stephen maybe came out for an hour or two every now and then, or maybe a day every now and then. But then something happened a couple of months ago. Stephen came out, was the dominant for a long time. And then now we're at this point where they're both kind of manifesting.
Right. Yeah, that makes some sense to me. I do think that, first of all, the idea of sort of having these two parallel lives, that here specifically it is about two distinct personalities, but that's kind of like the superhero theme for the most part, right? Is actually having this sort of, I wouldn't say Stephen had a very full life from what we saw, right?
Well, but one of them's living in London, the other's living in Chicago.
Right, yeah, that's complicated.
That alone.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, it seems like, we don't know, I think, how long Layla and Mark were together. So maybe that was like 6 months or a year or 5 years or 10 years. Like, it's unclear, right? But yeah, I think your read is, I buy that for the most part. It doesn't feel like Stephen's been working at the gift shop for a long time, right? Yeah. It feels like he's kind of like an entry level, been there for a little while, but not a long time. And, the security guard still doesn't know his name, although, that can be just the security guard doesn't pay attention to people or specifically to Stephen. But it's, I think I agree with what your take is. I think that seems likely to me, I guess I would say.
And I'll say it's likely based on what we know so far.
Right.
I think it's very possible that, and so given that, going back to the original question, I think that if Stephen was the dominant personality, again, I hope I'm using the proper terms. I very well may not be. I'm going to do some more research, and should have done that beforehand. I think for another personality to kind of, make this decision, I feel like I don't know quite enough about DID to say, but to me, to my uneducated mind, it would feel like, yeah, it's very ethically problematic to make that kind of decision without sort of the full, the consent of the council, as it were. The other thing that I'll say, though, and again, this is pure conjecture on my part, but from the little bit I know, part of why it's now referred to as DID, dissociative identity disorder, instead of multiple personality, is because of exactly that. Because often what it is a person who is going through trauma or something else like that and is disassociating from what they're experiencing, so much so that it's almost like, oh no, it's not me who's going through this, I'm this other identity. And that's very subconscious, and like the brain protecting itself, things like that. And I could easily, like, from what I understand of it, Stephen having this more and more difficult experience with Khonshu and have these horrible things happening, like for Stephen to start to disassociate because of that, or he's disassociating for his own reason, for other things, but now it's becoming worse and worse because of how horrible this Khonshu thing is, that would fit the little bit I know of DID. And so to me, I think it feels more like the decision to work with Khonshu was not really consensual even by Mark, by any of the personalities, but it was sort of agreed to by Mark. It was before Stephen was as manifested as Stephen is now.
Or during the
it's a lot
period
of
of time when he wasn't.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that would be sort of my conjecture. But what's your thought on this, on the ethical question?
Yeah, I feel like it's, to an extent, it's unanswerable because, for me, I feel like everything always depends on context, and we just don't have the context here yet, right? Of when that decision was made. It seems that the decision was made under duress, but we don't really know the exact circumstances of it, right? I mean, you're saying it wasn't necessarily totally consensual decision by Mark, right? That
Right.
Mark was pressured into it in one way or another. I feel like it might have something to do with Layla and maybe the backstory with her father. It's very unclear. It's very much a mystery at this point. And if it's unclear at the end of episode 6, I'll be disappointed, but I'm perfectly happy with it being unclear for now. Right.
Yeah.
It's like, I like mysteries to mostly get revealed. You can leave some teasers for season 2, sure. But, I would like to have a more clear idea what's going on with Steven and Mark and whoever else is in there, and sort of what actually happened to get Mark to decide, okay, I'm going to take this deal, maybe for all of us, kind of.
Right. Especially because the impression, at least I have from conversations we heard in the first 2 episodes, is it's not that Mark was like a perfect angel before Khonshu came along. That Mark had been doing some really shady things, kind of secret agenty something, and that may have been part of why he was starting to dissociate. I think the possibility that Mark was involved in the murder of Layla's father certainly is a very good possibility.
Seems quite possible.
Yeah. So, but yeah, great question. And let's make sure I'm going to save this question, Jordan, and we'll revisit it when we get to the end of the show, because I think it'll help give us more perspective.
For sure.
So I have a small bone I want to pick. And again, I'm going to give the show the possibility to correct this. And it starts with, I learned an important thing about the show, and this isn't a spoiler, because I learned it through things that have actually happened in the show. But I only learned them because I watched a TikTok of someone who had freeze-framed them. Which is that what we have learned is that, on some level at least, Mark, and I think both of them, but certainly Steven, is canonically Jewish. They freeze-framed that there is a mezuzah, which is, in Hebrew scripture, there's a certain passage from the Torah that you're supposed to have like ingrained, inscribed upon your wall of your home. The doorway of your home. And so you ever see, like, if you go into a Jewish home, there's often, like, right outside the doorway, a little thing bolted to the wall that has some Hebrew lettering on it. That's called a mezuzah. We saw one of those in the entryway to Stephen's house. And there's also apparently a shot, I forget which one of them, but wearing a Star of David. Now, so on the one hand, canonically Jewish character. Great. Pretty much the first, at least one of the first major ones, which is more significant in the MCU. Magneto is Marvel and is clearly Jewish and is becoming MCU in the future, but isn't yet. And we have had a couple of characters who were normally canonically Jewish not being made so. Wanda Maximoff being the most prime example. Though Wanda's also Romani, which is being ignored. There's a whole lot more with her.
Wanda's a lot of things in different takes, right? On Wanda.
Exactly. Exactly. But she's Magneto's daughter, in part.
Sometimes. Maybe.
Yeah, sometimes. Yes. But she's not the only one. There's a couple of other Jewish characters whose Jewishness has not been made clear.
Kitty Pryde, right? I think.
Kitty Pryde, I think, is another good one. So again, there's kind of the it's awesome that he's canonically Jewish, but if you have to freeze frame it to figure that out, not quite representation as we would like to have it. Now, and it may well be that by episode 6, we're going to get a lot more. So I don't want to by any means be like throwing the show under the bus. I want to see what's going to happen. But here's the thing. In 2 days from now, Jews around the world, myself included, will begin celebrating the holiday of Pesach, of Passover, which is the holiday that celebrates the Exodus, the Jewish people escaping from slavery in Egypt. Now, obviously, that is a mythological story. I think it's been pretty clearly proven that it is not connected to any kind of historical fact, that the Hebrew people were never there building the pyramids. But still, that's the story that's very connected to Judaism. And I have been wondering, it seems having a show about a Jewish character taking place during a major Jewish holiday, that could be a coincidence. Having it that's all about a Jewish character dealing with ancient Egypt and kind of being enslaved to an ancient Egyptian god, either it is not a coincidence or someone in the writer's room really was not willing to look at a calendar ever. But I kind of figured this episode especially is because especially this was the last episode before Passover, that we'd get something. Now, granted, Passover is an 8-day holiday, So the next episode will air during Passover. And I'm not saying it has to line up with that. You know, all these shows got moved around because of the calendar and COVID and stuff like that. But it's one more reason why it's sort of feeling to me like, okay, if you're going to make his Judaism a thing, there's a lot of tie-ins here we could talk about. So let's see if this comes up in some way.
I feel like that's probably less of a writer's room issue and more of a producer's issue in terms of like release schedule. That seems more like an executive producer thing. But yeah, that is a little on the nose. And it certainly would be interesting if the episode that airs actually during Passover, right? Because we're still before it a couple days.
Yeah, it starts. Jewish holidays always start at sundown, so it starts Friday night at sundown.
Right.
So and then it'll go for 8 days. So the next one will be on the third. I'm bad at math. On one of the nights of Passover.
Right. So given that, then maybe that would be the episode that ideally would maybe actually actively address some of this.
Quite possibly,
right?
Yeah. Possibly.
I wouldn't expect a lot. But but it would be great. You know, it's interesting that I had no idea this was the direction you're going. I thought you were gonna go with some of the mental health stuff direction, which I think there's a lot to say about as well. But yeah, I mean, it's funny because like the first Marvel movie that I think most people think of is the first X-Men movie, right? I mean, there was Blade before that, and I think there were some other things here and there. But the first X-Men movie starts like during the Holocaust, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, in that one, Magneto's Jewishness is front and center. Absolutely.
Right. And it's so key to his character and sort of everything that happens. And then continues to be in, First Class, right? When they show a little bit more of earlier times for Magneto. And, then the MCU has just not had any specifically Jewish representation. I mean, there's any number of characters who might be Jewish, right? Within the MCU.
Dr. Erskine, the German doctor, he, I believe, is Jewish.
Okay. I can't recall, but sounds right.
Okay.
But yeah, there's just been very little representation in that regard. And so it'd be nice to see finally something real, tangible. But I guess we'll have to wait.
Yeah, exactly. So, kind of like when you were talking about veganism, it was just an interesting thing for me to notice because the TikTok that I saw about it was just so fascinating. Where it's talking about like, yeah, it's great, it's official, it's canon. But we had to freeze frame to find it.
Yeah,
so let's hope it's not just that.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So with those two things kind of out of the way, let's dive into the episode itself. What did you think of this episode?
I liked it a lot. I thought it was interesting that it kind of showed Mark not really wanting to kill a bunch of people. That it's not like Mark's just the license to kill total sociopath like James Bond. Like, he's like, well, he's just a kid. I don't want to, and then that was horrible. But like, he's trying to fight without killing people until then when it becomes like, all right, well, now we're really fighting for survival in a way where we feel really threatened. So I'm just going to kill all these people at the end of the episode. But yeah, I think it almost seems to me like maybe Mark, like if Mark is whatever you would call it, whether you call it the dominant personality or what. If
let's just use that term, and then we can both apologize profusely.
Sure. Well, I'm not going to apologize for not knowing something, but I will try to learn it going forward. But if Mark was kind of like originally this was Mark, and then there was some trauma, then maybe there's like Steven, who's kind of the rejection of that violence. And maybe there's someone else who's like the full embracing of that violence.
Yeah. I think it's certainly possible.
I mean, it definitely seems like this episode positioned Mark more in the middle as opposed to as a polar opposite of Steven.
Right.
And I think that's a little interesting. And maybe that third personality isn't actually another personality. It's just Khonshu straight up taking over the body and being like, I'm just going to do stuff myself. But,
and it's especially interesting because I didn't even thought of this till you talked about it, but in the first episode especially, Mark fights Steven to take control of the body, but we don't necessarily it is definitely, I think, especially in this, I'm getting something mixed up. Basically, I'm just saying, like, I think the way it was done leaves some possibility that it wasn't always Mark taking over. Those couple of times where Steven kind of just blinks out and then comes back and he's surrounded by dead bodies.
Yeah.
Like, I think it might be this potential third personality.
For sure. Yeah, we don't know, because we didn't really get Mark's view on all of that happening, right? We got Steven's view, and then we met Mark, and so it was like, oh, that was probably Mark. But it's like, well, maybe not.
Right. So what did this episode kind of, the first two episodes we talked about how they were, the first episode was completely from Steven's perspective. This one, the second one, everything we saw was still something that Steven saw, even though sometimes it was when Steven was inside and Mark was the dominant.
Yeah.
Here, it seemed more like this was what Mark was seeing, and Steven was often there, but a couple times Steven or someone else took over and Mark wasn't in control. What did you think of that kind of shift in point of view character?
So I do think actually everything we saw was things Steven saw, basically, in this episode. Because I think Steven's he's like a passenger now, as opposed to like a prisoner, right?
Right.
And I feel like then when Steven takes over, Mark is in that position, right? Whereas Mark's not like hidden away, right? So I feel like they're
you're right.
Mostly trading back and forth. And then there's these kind of total blackout periods where we don't get to see what happened. And it seems like neither of them get to see what happened. And they're like, oh, what did you do? And they're like, I didn't do it. What did you do? Because we've got Mark yelling at Steven, because Mark clearly doesn't seem to know that there's a third personality, right?
Right.
And so if there is, which I'm like basically certain there is, unless that's just Khonshu, hijacking the body, then it seems like Mark and Steven are both in the dark on that, and we are still, because we don't see it. And I think there's an extent to which, here we saw things through Mark's actions, right? Mm-hmm. But I think we saw it the same way Steven sees it in a way.
Right.
And actually, I found when Steven came back at the end to take over, I don't know, I found it as very like soothing, presence. Like it was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And like we'd been kind of like along for a ride, and then it's like, okay, now, I don't know, I almost felt like more in control in some ways, maybe just because I relate more to Steven in some ways.
No, I think it's very true. I relate a lot more to Steven. I think we also just know a lot more about Steven. And I think I, at this point, feel like I know and I trust Steven's motivations. I don't know Mark's motivations, which actually, I think it further emphasizes what you're saying, that we are still seeing this through Steven's perspective. Yeah. It's just that it's Steven watching when Mark is in control.
Mm-hmm. And I really enjoyed that they both saw Steven as useful and important. Yeah. As opposed to him just being like, a nuisance who's like keeping Mark from being able to do Mark stuff.
Right.
Which wasn't the vibe in the first couple episodes.
Especially, in all those times when they're in Egypt and they need someone who can actually talk about Egyptian stuff. It was really fun watching, first of all, watching the way they were kind of going back and forth about the violence and not being okay with that. But then also especially that scene in the kind of with the rich collector, where like Mark clearly hates doing this, but he has to admit that he won't let Steven have control, but he'll let Steven kind of tell him what to do and walk through him.
Right, exactly.
And there's something else that they're doing, which I'm curious if it happens in DID, because it does happen with Green Goblin, who again is not actual DID, but it's kind of close, which is the reflection.
Right.
That they can only really see, they never actually see like a hallucination of each other. It's then when they see their reflection, it's often the reflection is the other personality. And I just think they're doing like with the knife blade, with the water, like they're just doing that so well.
Absolutely. Yeah. All the mirror play basically, I think was fantastic. I have to just give Oscar Isaac credit for being able to be these different people and to look so different without having a whole bunch of makeup and whatever. It's just like the way he holds himself is so different. The hairstyle a little differently, sure. But like his face looks different. And seeing him like go from one to another, it's just I don't know. It's very impressive.
It's incredible acting. It's incredible facial acting, which I'm really, really loving. And I think you're right. It's not much of the makeup, but I also really want to give heads up. I also really want to give props to the costume department. Costume department. Oops. And I wish Will was here to talk about it. Seeing the two different suits.
Yeah.
Seeing that they're clearly now going to commit to that is that when Steven's in the suit, it's going to look this way. And now we finally get to see the full, real Moon Knight suit in action. We got to see it doing combat stuff.
Yeah.
I see the Batman connection. It's very Batman.
Yeah. Well, there was one shot where he's jumping and his cloak or cape is like up in the air behind him and it looks like a crescent moon. And I was like, I feel like Will would be here saying that was a shot right out of the comics. But it also reminds me of, the Batman 89 shot where he flies the Batwing up in front of the moon to give like a bat signal basically in front of the moon.
Oh, and it's funny because you thought of that, because what I noticed is that I think it's somewhat the wind, but it also felt like the cape took a shape that it's meant to have.
Yeah.
And so it reminded me of Batman Begins, where Lucius Fox helps him the cloak is made of that memory stuff that can take this shape when electricity hits or something. So, yeah. So let's get to some of the interesting questions here, because we're starting to develop more of kind of who are the different sides in this. We meet a lot more of the Egyptian gods through their avatars, but then they all kind of hold this court. And Khonshu kind of tries to put Harrow, thank you. Tries to put Harrow on trial. He winds up kind of being put on trial. And as part of that, Mark/Steven's mental illness winds up being part of on trial. And it was a really interesting scene to watch, especially because I felt like, I want to get to the mental illness part in a second, but let me just start with, they're doing the thing that I love, which is characters are having a moral argument, and I'm not sure who I agree with. Which I just think is such good storytelling, where I know that we have seen all this reason that Harrow is wrong, and what Harrow wants to do is bad. But everything they said about Khonshu was yeah, that's true. But at the same side, we were seeing Khonshu have more of a altruistic motive than he has up to this point. So yeah, kind of what was your take on that whole scene?
Yeah, so there was one line that I thought was amazing where when Harrow is defending himself and really defending himself by attacking Mark and Steven and Khonshu, right? And which I think was really messed up, using mental illness to try to discredit someone. Which I'm sure happens all the time in our world, right? Yep. But then when Khonshu, or when Mark was like, look, he's trying to free Amit, right? And it's going to kill millions of people. And they're like, he has committed no offense. And that's the whole argument between Khonshu and Amit.
Oh, you're
right. Is that Harrow is like, sure, they haven't committed the offense yet, but we need to stop them from doing that. And here, the gods are kind of taking Khonshu's point of view of you're not supposed to do preemptive justice, right? He hasn't committed an offense yet. Whereas Harrow would punish himself for doing this if he thought it were a bad thing. So it's this paradox that I think was kind of hilarious. And just those exact words, I was like, oh, they got you,
I think that's brilliant if it's intentional.
I think it has to be.
I hope it does, because the thing is, I feel like the only way that makes sense is if the council is also completely unaware of what Harrow has been doing.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, if I find you outside the bank, casing out the bank with a whole bunch of safe cracking tools, attempted robbery is still a crime, even if robbery hasn't been committed. And Harrow did lead his people to the tomb.
Yeah.
I'm kind of unsure why they then left all that. I kind of want to get
I think they're digging extensively, and it's going to take a while, so is my feeling.
He's letting his people do that thing.
Exactly.
But to me, so there's something happening there. He's also murdering little old ladies because the tattoo on his arm tells him to.
Right.
So I feel like what you're saying would only make sense if the point is that the council doesn't know about those things. And that's certainly possible.
They seem disinterested,
Mm-hmm.
I think, and I don't think I think the irony is supposed to be sort of for the audience's sake, not that
Yeah.
the gods themselves are deliberately trying to have irony that way. Although they did
That's fair.
punish the god, right? They imprisoned Amit for this like proactive, preventative
Right.
justice, right? This like punishing people before they did anything.
Right.
But yeah, I think I get the sense that I see two possibilities. One is that the gods are basically like, look, it's not up to us to meddle. We're just the Eternals. I mean, we're just the Ennead.
Exact same thing, yeah.
And we're just going to hang back. And that's why we haven't showed up in the MCU before. And, or one or more of them are actually plotting to release Amit for whatever reason,
Right.
I'm not sure. I didn't catch the entire lineup basically of gods here, but like,
Yeah.
if one happened to be Set, I wouldn't trust that guy.
I'm pretty sure Set was not one of them.
No,
But
me
certainly
too.
the
Osiris
one who's the
was
god.
right?
Osiris was. Horus was. The character who until now I would have thought was pronounced Isis. I think they said Isis or something
Okay.
like that was. And then the Hortho, I think her name was the
Hathor,
goddess
I think.
of
Hathor?
Hathor, yeah, of like love and dancing
Yeah,
and
music.
who I think kind of has a thing with our pigeon-headed god from way back in the day.
Yeah.
And I have no idea to trust her. Like, I don't trust her at all in terms of her like coming up to Steven afterwards and being like, "Oh, hey, here's a little, I'll work with you."
Right.
Like I think she's got. I don't think that she's out to outright screw him, but I think she definitely has her own agenda that's probably not going to go well for Mark/Steven.
Yeah, I don't feel confident that that's the case, but I certainly respect that as a reasonable possibility. It would not be surprising.
It is a hunch, not a confirmed theory.
For sure.
In terms of the mental illness thing, I felt like there were two different things going on. One of which I hated, the other of which I loved, and I think they did it intentionally. And so I think it's fantastic writing.
Okay.
But I'm not sure, and I kind of want to hear from other people's thoughts on it as well, including yours. Because on the one hand, you're right. There's definitely, especially with mental illness that can sometimes affect your perceptions in ways where, like, when you're really not doing well, a lot of paranoia can happen, or a lot of sort of like catastrophizing, or things where like your perceptions of reality, not like a hallucination way, but clear, like you are not perceiving reality in the most clear way. And it's not for everybody. I speak very much here for myself. And I think it makes sense that some people would find it hard to trust you, but because of because of all the stigma of mental illness and lack of understanding of like that's not how someone is all the time, that definitely can be very gaslighting in a way, or can definitely be very like not gaslighting, but like a kind of like people treat you as the person who cried wolf,
Right.
And that sucks and that's terrible. And I hated Harrow using that. But I also could see the fact that it was effective was like, yeah, this sucks, but this happens. And I kind of was glad to see it's like that's not representation, but it kind of is in terms of like, yeah, here's a way that like we get screwed by this part of our society. But the other part of what he was saying was he was I keep want to say Kefnet, is that the Ravenhead's god's name?
You mean oh jeez. No. You mean the main Khonshu?
Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Where did I get Kefnet?
There is a Tefnut is a god, but
yeah. But anyway, but with Khonshu, but the other part of what Harrow is saying like, look, Khonshu he sort of wants to Mark Steven to acknowledge that they're unwell as a way of showing that Khonshu is like, it's like, I don't know what the exact rules are about like who you can take as an avatar, but it seems like there's this idea of like an avatar should have some level of consent, willingness in this, and that Mark Steven being unwell means that like this is a situation where Khonshu is taking advantage of Mark. I'm just gonna call him Mark 'cause I think that's who most relates with. But Mark Steven.
Yeah,
however you wanna refer
yeah.
to him.
Well, Khonshu's deal is with Mark, I think.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And like in that regard, like if Khonshu sought out Mark in part because of Mark going through DID or whatever Mark's going through, and that made him more vulnerable, or that made him like, oh, no one will ever believe him because he's going to get misbelieved by everyone already. Like, that's a pretty horrible thing Khonshu's doing, and Harrow is right to point that out. So yeah, I was very conflicted in that scene, and I part of me wishes that they had just made it clear that it was one or the other, but part of me actually kind of loves that they mixed the two.
Yeah, I thought that scene was really powerful. I thought it was unpleasant, but unpleasant in a powerful way, and I do, it's hard when there's things that are like bad in our world, right? And it's like you want to have some level of representation, and you want to represent the things that people go through, right? Not even just because of whatever's going on with themselves, but because of the way society treats people based on whatever identity someone has. But like I think as a writer, you want to avoid having that be the only aspect of whatever it is, right? And I feel like they're doing more than just that. So,
it felt earned to me in
right.
that regard. This felt like, kind of to put it kind of you're talking about, like you've made enough jokes about other people being dumb about veganism that having one joke at the vegan's expense is okay. Especially because it didn't feel like we were made to look down on Mark. To me, it was more like, I feel like now if I'm trying to explain this, when I've had this situation in my life, I can say to someone, hey, you remember like what happened with Mark and Khonshu? That's kind of like what I went through.
Right.
Which to me is exactly what representation should do, even when it's the hard stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So, I overall, I liked that, and I would understand if somebody's like, hey, I've been there too many times. I don't want to see that. Right. And sure.
Yeah, I'm not by any means going to speak for all mentally ill folk. And I totally respect someone else or many other people who are like, nah, we don't need to see that. Please take that off,
And actually circling back to Jordan's question from earlier, if Khonshu specifically sought out Mark because of all this, he kind of did something, in a way that he couldn't necessarily get full consent or didn't bother to get full consent, right? Yeah. In the way that, because in the way that you could with somebody who wasn't dealing with, with
like to me it's like hitting on someone who's drunk, or something like that. It's
right.
Like you can't. And here's where more I want to do research, because I think there's often there can be an assumption that this is more with like developmental disabilities. There used to be this basic perception that like people with developmental disabilities just had to be sexless because they couldn't consent.
Right.
That's changed quite a lot, although some people still hold some of those ideas. Yeah. And I certainly don't want to put in a position where it's like, because this person has DID, they can't consent to, all sorts of different things. But yeah, I think the idea that Khonshu recognized that this person would not have the ability to say no the way someone else would in quite the same way, even if it has nothing to do with mental illness. I mean, just like, oh, hey, you own a debt and I'm going to exploit you because of that. Like, that's not consent,
Right, yeah.
So, yeah. What else from this episode kind of jumped out at you?
Well, right in the beginning, right, when they kind of establish Layla a little more, right, we get some actual kind of alone time with her, just seeing what her world is like with, I think, her mom, right? I think that was her mom, making the passport for her.
Wait, her mom?
In the beginning, you don't think that was her mom? I thought that was the implication.
Oh, I didn't think that person was female. I thought that was a male person.
Oh, maybe. I didn't think so.
I had the impression that was like an old family friend.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, whoever that was the Mira Sorvino character to Layla's Chow Yun Fat. from the Replacement Killers, the whole making the passport thing.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
anyway. But
that was definitely a fun scene.
Anyway, yeah, the when she's talking about returning artifacts that have been stolen already.
Yeah.
I think that was an important thing to include here.
Especially since we started at the British Museum, which is,
right.
By many people's designations, the, highest has the
you almost said suppository. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Which has, as many people would define it, the highest number of stolen artifacts, stolen items anywhere in the world.
Right.
Took me way too long to figure out how to say that sentence. But yeah. So it was definitely nice to have that kind of it's like I've seen some ideas of like what a modern day Indiana Jones movie should be, and the idea being that it should be like his granddaughter, all the stuff where he was like, this should belongs in a museum, and being like, no, Grandpa, it belongs back where it was.
Right, right.
Like, and granted, Indy was always saying like it should be a museum instead of like this, rich French guy who works with the Nazis collection. But the idea that it should just maybe stay in that cave in South America just doesn't really occur to him.
Right, exactly. It's like, what? I'm an archaeologist. That means I go and take things from places.
Definitely.
And bring them back to where I live. There was a great Indiana Jones moment, I thought, where Mark is fighting all the guys with the knives, and that one guy like licks his knife, and which I've seen enough of people like licking their swords or whatever, and it's like, what are you doing? And then Mark just like punches him in the face repeatedly while he's doing it. Yeah. It's like, there you go. And it was a lot like the guy swinging the sword around and then just Indy just shooting him because Harrison Ford was sick that day.
Yeah, sick, hungover, depends on which story you hear. Yeah, exactly. So one thing I wanted to point out, this is less an ethical question as much as just kind of a overall continuity question. I realized, like, until they briefly mentioned Madripoor. Am I pronouncing that right? Madripoor. There had been nothing in, like, this did not have to be an MCU show. It was completely disconnected from everything in the MCU.
Yeah.
There's a couple, again, blink if you miss it. Like, apparently on some of the buses driving around London, there are ads for the Repatriation Council, which is the group that was very involved in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. So it's like them. In that time period. But here's my thing, and this is something you and I have brought up again and again, is that we love the stories that are kind of low level and are focused on one individual character, with the idea being like, yeah, why would the Avengers care, about like this guy named Vulture selling weapons and whatever. Right. I kind of think, though, that when there's an eclipse of the sun that no one was expecting, and then the stars turn back to a day thousands of years ago, someone in the, Sorcerer's house on Bleecker Street, or like Thor, or someone's gonna be like, that's odd. Maybe we should check that out.
Yeah.
Maybe we should look into that.
Jane Foster, maybe.
And granted, like, Jane Foster is gonna be off. She's got her own movie coming out, so something's happening with her right now. Who knows? Captain Marvel's doing off Captain Marvel things, but like, these are the moments where the idea that this is a story that no one else in the universe is noticing, even though we know there's all these super powerful people, for me, it starts to bend credulity.
Yeah. Yeah, to me, that's where the MCU kind of strains under its own weight, where the bigger it gets, the harder it is to believe that these things all actually are taking place in the same universe or multiverse, I guess. But I don't care. I respect the feeling and the reaction, and I share it in a lot of ways, but I feel like, for me, I'm just like, yeah, they mentioned Madripoor, I'm like, oh, right, this is the MCU, whatever. Like, I do think it would have been brilliant to have, like, a post-credit scene, like, sort of like the Avengers in the, the shawarma shop type thing where there's someone's just like, what the, and it's like there isn't necessarily much of a payoff, but just it's like you see that like, yeah, there's these global events and there's these characters reacting to them in some sort of way. It's not necessarily the thing where they're gonna have any means of actually figuring out what happened, right? But like just seeing some of the characters that exist in the same universe reacting to it, I think would have been great,
Yeah. Like Doctor Strange and Wong, one of them noticing the other being like, no, reality is falling apart at the seams. We don't care about each other.
Right, we've got a multiverse to save or destroy or whatever they're going to do. I don't know.
And I think you're right. I think on some level, if they hadn't said the word Madripoor, I wouldn't have cared in the slightest. I'd be like, yeah, okay, this is not really an MCU show. It's just a cool show, and I'm here for it.
Yeah.
The fact that I know at some point it is going to tie back into the larger MCU is where it starts to be like, okay, well, if it does, then you have to do it in a way that makes sense, and this doesn't make sense. But I've now talked about it for 3 minutes, and that it didn't take away my enjoyment of the show. I wanted to make the point. We can now move on with our lives.
It's a very reasonable peeve. I will certainly grant that.
But it is not the first nor the last
no,
to come up in the MCU, not. And it is hardly the most grievous. For sure. So what do you think of and this may kind of be a good place to wrap up. Like, what do you think of Khonshu as a character? Because the first couple episodes, it really seemed like he was just like, this was just an ego battle between two gods about which one was right. And we were sort of saying by the end of the last episode, like, okay, Amit doesn't seem great, but Khonshu doesn't seem great either. Here, Khonshu is still treating people pretty badly, but now we have more of an idea of why Amit raising is really bad. And Khonshu is clearly willing to, like, put himself in danger so that Amit can be stopped. How does that... Is this still just because it's all Khonshu's ego? Did this change your view of his character at all?
I mean, I feel like we have a little bit, a significantly clearer idea what's going on. I do think the sort of self-sacrifice of being like, yeah, if they imprison me, they imprison me. Whatever, like, we need to do this. Sort of makes me buy that it's less of an ego trip. I never really saw it that way as much as just like, seems like someone who specifically believes in something, like a particular manner of justice, and is a tool, like, like is just like not a very nice god, but like has an idea of what what he thinks right and wrong is, and somebody else has their own idea, and they're just, they're conflicting viewpoints, one of which I disagree with more than the other, but for me, it still feels like sort of like bad and worse, you know? Like, Khonshu doesn't seem like the good guy, Khonshu seems like the less bad guy, basically.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good way to put it, and I think, I think Khonshu definitely thinks he's doing the right thing. I think, like anyone with great amounts of power, when you think you are using your power to do good, and you think that anyone who's getting in your way is stopping you from doing good, it becomes possible to justify almost anything because you're doing good,
right.
And that's a real problem.
Yeah.
I also think there may be an interesting parallel here of Khonshu has been yelling and screaming about this for a while, and it seems like maybe he's also maybe he's not totally stable about the situation, or even if it's for totally different reasons, he's also kind of the god who cried wolf to the other god. Like, right. The gods are just kind of like, oh, it's Khonshu going on about Amit again. And like, we know that he's right, but we kind of, to me, I wonder if maybe that might be a more defensible reason why Khonshu picked Mark, is because Khonshu sort of like sees himself in Mark in terms of the like, people don't believe us, this guy's going to get me, I'm going to get him.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of an avatar, right, is like someone who represents you in body and deed, I think. I mean, right. My understanding from like Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, like that's where it originated. That's where I first heard the term avatar, I think. But like
it is clearly not someone tied to one of the 4 seasons or the 4 directions or the 4 elements, and it is clearly not a large blue cat-like person.
Right.
So those 2 definitions of avatar are off the table. Yeah, this is the more kind of like it is the living embodiment of a god on Earth.
Right. But like specifically through some sort of possession / endowment with one's powers.
Right.
Right.
And it's interesting because we certainly saw a lot of that. Like, I felt like the way Mark was fighting did not quite match what I would have expected from the kind of, like, they were hard fights and he was winning the fights, but he wasn't like what we saw in the first couple of episodes was like Mark surrounded by Steven surrounded by a bunch of people with guns, and then 20 seconds later Steven surrounded by a bunch of dead bodies.
Right.
And like I felt like we weren't getting Mark fighting on that level, and maybe that's just because it's hard to convey, or maybe it is because of that third personality. But certainly we showed that like Mark was stabbed through the torso with numerous like spears.
Repeatedly. He went all Boromir in this episode.
Yeah, I was just like, all right, that's a scratch in my... I'll just sew that up. Like,
yeah, I'll just literally impale other people on my pincushion, lances stuck through my body, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah, and Khonshu did refer to it as my healing armor or something, right? Or my healing suit, right? So clearly they gave us that ahead of time so that when we saw that, we would not be like, wait, that doesn't make any sense. We're like, oh yeah, that's they said that before. So that totally, cool.
Exactly. Well, I think that's about all I had to say about the episode. Any other last comments you wanted to make?
Yeah, I wanted to circle back to something we were talking about in the first episode, which was in terms of representation, Egyptian representation. And in this episode, we learn that Mark is not Egyptian, right? It's pointedly so that he's not trusted because he's not Egyptian, whereas Layla is, and she is portrayed by an actress of Egyptian descent, May Kalamawi. And apologies if I'm mispronouncing that. And the director, Mohammed Diab, who I think directs like 5 episodes I've seen credited or something. But he's a well-known Egyptian director. And so I think having that Egyptian representation, I think, is great, And I think, especially given, how heavily based it is on Egyptian mythology, I think that's important. So I'm glad that we saw that, that's the case. There's the whole thing about Mark and being Jewish, but not really being portrayed that way that much. And that would be nice to maybe get a little bit more out of that as well. But
yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think with Egypt especially, I had a partner who was Egyptian, and so this is something she would comment on a lot. There's an additional level of complication in that, the population of modern day Egypt largely stems from mass Arab immigration that happened with the spread of Islam, like centuries and centuries after this. And so, like, I was glad they specifically pointed out that the language of sort of ancient Egypt is Coptic, is not Arabic.
Yeah.
And that the sort of like, so the I don't know much about the sort of anthropology here, but yeah, like the people who are in Egypt now are not necessarily like the people who were like the ancient Egyptian. But yeah, certainly, like, it's so much of it's set in Egypt. That's the connection. I think that is a level of complication that it's very hard to sort of like bring into a show like this. So yes, having that, like, there is no Coptic representation to have, so this is definitely the representation to have, and I think it feels very fitting.
Yeah, I do wonder whether Ethan Hawke butchered Arabic as badly as Mandarin, but
oh, that's interesting.
I don't know. I love having all of these languages represented in fiction. It would just be nice if, like, when there's one line or 2 lines, it's like, come on, can't we just like get like spend some hours and just nail it,
Yeah, or even just like, he is so proud of himself and of this great community.
Yeah.
And I kind of love the idea if it's basically the community is a bunch of people who have been doing 20 minutes of Duolingo every day for like 5 years. And so, yeah, they know some, but their pronunciation's pretty bad.
Right.
Like, I would be fine with that if it fits the characters.
Sure, if
So
if there was like some shade cast at him, it's like, what was it? Oh, that was Mandarin? Like what?
yeah, but yeah, like you said, it sounded like that wasn't it. It just sounded like it was just writers who didn't understand
Right,
what that was
right.
supposed to be. So yeah, all right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. Paul, you want to talk quickly about what you're doing with poker these days?
Yeah, I've got a YouTube channel, Zen Madman Poker, on YouTube. That's where YouTube channels are. I'm making a lot of videos. Finally got up to 100 subscribers. I need 1,000 to get monetized, so I'm looking towards that. And
10% on the way. 10% on the way. We're building.
Yeah, I'm trying to create content that is both accessible to people who don't know a ton about poker, but also informative for people who are quite experienced. And I put a lot of Mephisto references in my videos. and sometimes some other random Marvel episodes. I think the other one had like a Hulk reference and another one, I forget what it was. But
and I will say, in both cases, the Mephisto references have been earned.
I appreciate that.
There were things that occurred in the game that were out of your control. That was like, yep, this is Mephisto. So yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. I know some poker. I'm by no means the level Paul is. I'm able to follow along. I know other people who are not even into poker at all have just been able to enjoy it. I've been sharing it with some friends who are really liking it. So definitely check out all the things Paul's doing. Another check out, if you want to see the other podcasts I'm doing, check out it all on theethicalpanda.com. We just did an episode of Star Wars Rebels, or that is going to come out later this week, about Twilight of the Apprentice, which is just some of the I think
good.
I think one of the best hours of Star Wars media of any form, and certainly some of the absolute best of episodes of television.
Yeah, I would just say media. Like,
yeah,
it's one of the best things I've seen anywhere.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's what I said. Like one of the best of any kind of Star Wars medium. Yeah. So definitely that'll come out probably Thursday. This will hopefully come out on Wednesday. Depends on how awake I stay while I try to edit it. We'll see. But definitely, and that's also where you can send in feedback. As you heard, we love Jordan's question. We'd love to hear more. Let us know what you think. Where are you on this? Would love to, and if you have perspectives on mental illness, perspectives on Egyptian gods, just what you love about the show, what you don't like about the show, what you think about what we're saying. Let us know. Find all of that on theethicalpanda.com. On behalf of myself, Paul, thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.
Bye.